with Dr. Lehan Stemmet, a good friend, firstly, and someone who I really admire as far as has really stuck their teeth into this whole area of resilience. A fellow Christian as well, and also a lecturer at a university, so understands the educational climate. So welcome, Lehan.
Hi, Sean. Very nice to see you again, and I'm really pleased to join you. And I'm looking forward to our conversation and see what comes out of it. And if I'm going to position it right now. If there are any other questions that people pick up on, they're welcome to contact me as well, and I'll answer to the best of my ability.
Yeah.
Afterwards.
Well, the main theme really that I contacted you about was just to say, like, the audience that we will have and the interest that I have is around Christian schooling, Christian education, and obviously in New Zealand, COVID-19 is, as it is around the world, taken quite a strong hold on our schools and on our people. And so how do we in Christian education take this moment, time which is unprecedented and also uncertain for many people, how do we take through this time good steps to build resilience in our kids? So we'll frame that through a whole bunch of different questions, and hopefully that'll frame up that question as a whole towards the end there. So
great.
Let's start with the first question that I have really is with your study that you have had around resilience, like how would you define resilience?
So I think what I'll do is I'll quickly position that first and foremost as a definition of resilience. If I could summarize it very quickly, when I speak to people, I often hear them asking me questions about resilience, and what they're actually asking me is how to become more tenacious or how to have more endurance, and they're quite different. Endurance is the ability to continue on for quite a long time, and tenacity is more of a mental commitment, whereas resilience is not that. Resilience is the ability to recover very quickly after an event, whether it was a stressful event or just a pressure event. Resilience is the ability to recover. The same way in athletics or any other sports. Athletes, for example, are very good at pacing themselves. So that's what makes them endurant. That's the endurance bit of it. They're very good at pacing themselves. And resilient people are also very good at pacing themselves, because from their perspective, it's easier to not overdo it and recover little bits at a time than it is to overdo it and then have this big job of recovering back to a normal state. So you can almost compare resilience to fitness in sport, where it's the sooner and the quicker you recover from a situation that you were in, the more resilient you are. So some people would call it emotional fitness, and it's basically just the recovery to normal heart rate, normal blood pressure, normal psychological functioning, and so on. And I think what we can also maybe touch on is just briefly potentially a definition of stress as well, because it kind of feeds into what resilience is all about. And so when you look at all the literature out there are, broadly speaking, three definitions of stress, or how researchers try to position stress. And especially in the mass media. In the mass media, we come across stress quite often. And how they define it is, they would say that stress is either the thing that happens out there and that causes the stress, so that it's the thing out there that causes stress. And that generally is not true, because people respond differently to the same thing. And I often use examples, and I might use an example of public speaking, for example. Some people don't mind it, they love it, and some people just absolutely hate it. So public speaking in itself is not a cause of stress. It just depends on how people respond to that. And then the second way they define it is, they might say that maybe stress is the response. But it also can't be true, because some people are excited about public speaking and some people are anxious about public speaking. But either way, their blood pressure goes up and their heart rate goes up. So the physiology doesn't explain stress either. And then the third way that it's often defined is to say, well, maybe it's a combination of the event, in what they call the stressor, and the response. But you can't take two wrong definitions and make a right definition for stress. So none of those three, although they explain it to some extent, none of them actually explain it completely, because all three leaves out the individual's choices, the individual's coping strategies, the individual's perception, and so on. And so that's quite a key element of resilience as well. It's how we perceive what's happening to us psychologically and physiologically as well.
straight away I'm learning stuff. I think there's a great definition around the match fitness versus just being able to run for 5 or 10 kilometers and keep that pace. It's really good, and obviously taking into account people's all can be hitting the same situation but dealing with it in different ways. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So it's around us, and a lot of people talk about it. I remember back in Bible college, you brought up the thing around stress. We suddenly got into this conversation, and we did some study on stress, and it was a funny conversation because the guy was saying actually until we labeled stress, nobody knew they were stressed.
Exactly.
Are we finding that as we label and define resilience, we're finding we've got less and less of it?
Yeah. Oh, and I think that's an interesting point. So years ago, and you might remember this, it's long ago, but it's not that long ago. Typical stress training, what they called back then, it was quite popular, was doing this sort of stress training with people instead of resilience training. And stress training often started off with these life event scales that had a couple of life events listed, and then you ticked off which ones happened to you. And there were things like death of a loved one, divorce, getting a new job, winning the lotto, all sorts of things. And then they predetermined on those lists how stressed you should be for each and every one of those events.
That's
And so what often
exactly
happened
what
is,
it is that I remember that reminded me of this whole thing was doing one of
exactly.
those things. How many times you've moved houses, for example, relationships, and that thing gave you a score, didn't it?
Exactly. It gave you a score, and so it only had two outcomes. Either people were stressed because they actually now saw how stressed they were because of all the things that happened in their lives, or they were stressed because they weren't as stressed as this thing said they should have been if they had gone through all of those different
Exactly.
things.
Yeah.
So there's only
Perfect.
two outcomes, and it's you're going to be stressed either way.
It's really good. So tell me, interesting topic, but really, what motivates you in this area?
The real passion started many years ago. It was mainly due to some personal things that I needed to deal with from childhood. And then also at the time I was dealing with a couple of things as well. And so we're going back probably about 25 plus years now. And so I developed this interest in how people cope with things and why some people flourish when other people fall apart. So it was basically, it was a personal project, and I ended up calling it, for myself, I called it Deal With It, because I found that there is no other way. You've got to deal with the things that you're facing. And it didn't mean harden up or toughen up. It literally meant you've got to face it. And and so that was the one side that was interesting for me. But the other side was I've always had this deep passion. And when I say for a long time, I mean from school days. I've always been a leader in school, in the school context as well. And what always fascinated me is how do we help people to become the best that they can be? And that's always been a passion. So the passion then drove further looking into this topic of stress, because what I discovered is that 75 to 90% of all psychological and physical illnesses can be traced back to stress as the onset, not the cause, but as the onset. And the second thing that aligned with it is that stress also seemed to be the biggest limiting factor. In other words, stress, but also the inability to be resilient, seemed to be the biggest factor that held people back from becoming the best they can be. So the passion was helping people to become the best they can be. And therefore I became interested in stress as well, because it was just this big thing that prevented people from actually achieving their best, their personal best. So that's what drove it, and it still is a passion. Every single time I meet a new person, whether it's a student, whether it's a staff member, whether it is just somebody I know, I'm deeply interested in helping people overcome some of those barriers. I mean, we can't do it for them, but we can actually put a bit of a light on the issue, and maybe explain to them some of these things that we know, and that might help them to deal with the things that they need to deal with to become the best that they can be, and then contribute to other people as well. I think that's the bigger value of all of these. It's not just for ourselves, but it's about also becoming the best we can be, because then we can add value to communities, to society, to our family, and to other people in general.
I want to take the conversation just in a slightly different tack. You said it was quite personal as far as your journey goes, without getting into the personal side of it. You're a dad. You have 3 young children. Is your study of resilience, does that cause you to do anything different that you try to do with your own kids that helps build them to become more resilient as they grow?
I think what I've learned, so a quick answer is what I've learned over the years is that we can't do that on behalf of someone else. It's like learning. People need to do their own learning. People need to go through their own journey of building resilience. And it's a question I get quite often when I present workshops and talks as well, as people ask me this question very often: how do we build it in our kids? I mean, and there are different ways. I mean, we can give them something to read, we can give them something to look at. But in the end, whether you give somebody a book to read or get them to watch videos about running a race, for example, all that does is it teaches them techniques. And I'll use an example. Years ago, I did karate. And one of the things that we learned is our sensei could tell us how to do karate, and he could show you all the different styles and so on. And he could tell you that if someone punches you in the stomach, you've got to breathe out. But until someone actually punches you in your stomach, you never know what it's like. And so I think the same principle applies. Is it's not like we're trying to get our kids to experience bad things on purpose, but they will experience some things that happen. It might be, I don't know, maybe a teacher spoke to them in a way that they didn't like, or a friend said, no, we don't want to play with you. And I'm talking about little kids now, right? So under 6 years, a kid doesn't want to play with them, or, I mean, you never know, or someone pulls their hair, or there's a bully, or whatever it might be. And it's just about walking alongside them and guiding them through some of the wisdom and some of the lessons that we've learned. I think the probably one of the worst things we can do is trying to prevent those bad things from happening to our kids at all. I think what it does is it creates kids who don't understand. You know, the first time they get punched in the stomach, they don't even know what it's about. So slowly but surely, we've got to just build that sort of skill to unpack what's happening to them. But I think that could happen for any community. That could happen for any kids, for any family, whether they are Christians or not. One of the things that I have learned that stands out above all the others, in terms of the resilience research and the stress research and just general mental and physical health, is the value of being part of a religious community, and specifically in our context, a Christian community. So I think by, for example, putting your children in a Christian school, you're already a step ahead of the rest, because there's incredible value in being part of a Christian community because of the foundations, because of the community that it creates, because of the belief system. And we can unpack some of those religious qualities as well, as we go along. But I think there's tremendous value in having a kid in a Christian school.
Yeah, that's good. You bring up your point about parents, and as a Christian school, you know, as a principal, regardless of what school I'm at, I'm surprised, but not surprised, about how quickly some parents are to jump to the rescue of their child. And it's almost like it's this complete bubble that people, you know, we say we struggle with kids having no resilience nowadays, and yet I see parents at the gate of the school and, you know, banging down my office pretty quickly if something doesn't go according to plan. And obviously we don't want kids to face hard times, and you love your kids to bits, but sometimes it's a disservice as it is. Something we would see as a disservice as far as building resilience in kids when we don't allow them, in a sense, to deal with, you talk about deal with it, face those things. Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, no, it's a key. It's such a key thing. And once again, I think there's a balance that we need to strike between stepping in. It's not like their lives are in danger necessarily. I mean, the things that we're talking about is not things that puts their lives in danger. It's probably more psychological in nature. And I think you're right. We are doing them a disservice if we don't give them an opportunity to work their way through that, to think their way through that, to talk their way through that. And so the question I often ask myself as well is whether the decision that I make, for example, with our kids, it's a natural thing for a dad. If you see your little girl and there's a little boy in the sandpit and they throw sand on your little girl, I mean, immediately you want to step in, because that's just dad's nature. But then the other side of me being a dad is, hang on a little bit. Am I still going to be doing this for her when she's 25? Am I still going to be doing this for her when she's 35? How many times do I have to step in the future to save her from something that is not life-threatening, but just psychological? And so what can I do then instead? And then it's just a matter of then talking them through things like even little things like understanding what bullying is all about. That maybe the problem is not you, maybe the problem is the bully who actually has a problem they haven't dealt with. So I start those conversations quite early on with our kids. And I think one of the things I've also learned is that we often underestimate their ability to understand what we would perceive as complex issues. Kids understand these things. I'm always amazed by how much wisdom they actually have, and we just don't understand. We kind of underestimate their ability to understand, and for us to have the conversation with them to work their way through that.
So the line of the question started with, what do you do as a dad trying to help your kids build resilience? And I guess a part of that question really has to be answered with is, what do you not do? And is that whole being the rescue boat and jumping in there and saving the kids? It's a really tough one I'd love any advice that you had as far as dealing with a parent, and I guess this isn't the forum for it, but when that parent does come in wanting to rescue the kids, finding the words in the moment to say, do you understand what you're doing to your child right now by rescuing them the way that you are? But they're not often ready for that conversation. I guess that's something we have to build in our community as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I suspect, the what I've found over the years with a lot of different scenarios, whether it is coaching managers and leaders, or whether it's speaking to parents groups and so on, what I often find is people don't like to be set on the right path, but what they don't mind is for us to have a conversation with them and kind of unpacking what is it that sits behind all of this. And often they care just as much as we care, but they care more in the moment, and we care more about the future. And I can understand that. And I think the other thing I often do is I would tell people that I understand where they're coming from. As a dad, as a parent, I have exactly the same emotions. The trick is not to let the emotions take over when we should really be thinking about what we're doing and what's good in the long run. I mean, if you think about, I also used to do athletics as a kid, and I remember also one of the things I loved sports, and my parents never put any pressure on me to do sport or to do well academically. But one of the things that they did very well is they taught me to take responsibility for consequences. And I remember that as clear as daylight. So I remember saying to my mom, look, it's exam time and I'm off to the tennis court. I'm going to go and play some tennis. And she would ask me one question. She'd say to me, what would you like to do when you finished with school? And then I'd tell her, and she said, do you think you've studied enough to be able to get into that? And so I think that's a key thing that she did really, really well. As she taught me that element of personal responsibility. There's a consequence, but they were always very, very supportive as well. If something went wrong, they wouldn't deal with it on my behalf, but they would take me just through a journey of thinking about things that was very useful.
So let's consider we're in schools, and we have students with different levels of resilience within them. There'd be some obvious signs, I guess, as far as those that are not resilient, but there's other things that are probably hidden. Can you talk through some of the, from your research and from what you're seeing, some of the obvious signs of low resilience and some of the things that might not be so obvious as well?
I'll start with, I think one of the key things is that it manifests. You won't necessarily notice the low resilience, but you will notice the effect of low resilience. So you might see somebody who is quite lonely. You might see somebody. I mean, actually, one of the things that drives it quite often is mental health concerns as well. And one of the biggest mental health concerns we have in New Zealand is probably anxiety and depression. I think 1 in 4 people will be diagnosed with anxiety or depression in New Zealand, which is, you think about it, I mean, that's over 1 million people in New Zealand with our population. It also means that 1 in 4 people that you interact with will probably have either anxiety or depression. The good news is it's treatable. But one of the things I normally keep in mind is to say to people, it's not so much the consistent behavior that's the issue. It is when there's a change in behavior. As soon as you observe a change in behavior, that's a clear sign that something's up. And we're not always resilient to the same level about the same things. There's a whole bunch of stuff that could play a role in that as well. So let's say, for example, um, I mean, you can just think about it once again as a parent. Some days you're in top form because you had enough sleep, and some days you're not in top form because you didn't have enough sleep, because kids keep you up. And the same is true for children as well. One day, a comment that someone else makes towards them might not be a hurtful comment, and they might just brush it off and all's good and they move on. But one day there might be a case where maybe, I don't know, maybe they saw mum and dad having a bit of an argument, and that day suddenly the same thing that happened the previous day just has a bigger impact on them. One of the other signs, and it's a difficult thing to see, I think, is the support that they have at home as well, and what is happening at home. We're not always, as educators, we're not always aware of that. When I was a lecturer, I remember not being able to, I wouldn't know whether some of my students had parents who were sitting in jail, for example. I wouldn't know that. But it had a major impact on them. And you could just see the shift in behavior very quickly. When they were very engaging in class and suddenly they start withdrawing. They're not as engaging. They don't say hello. They get moody about things as well. And I suppose another example would be when you see that there's a drop in performance as well, academic performance. So withdrawal, change in behavior, usually with all the psychological issues we pick up, with the golden thread through all of them is an inability to interact on a social level at an appropriate level. That's probably the golden thread through all medical, all psychological challenges and mental illnesses that we've picked up over the years.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about the kids who have maybe a parent in hospital or in jail or something like that. Again, as you said before, it's not necessarily the event that determines whether they are resilient or not, but sometimes those ones become more resilient because of what they have faced. Someone gave me the analogy once, and I saw it in true life when we had a hurricane come across the Cayman Islands, and it was trees that had suffered quite difficult years, that were lean years, that had the rings, I guess, the growth rings that were the strongest, that lasted the longest. And it was, in fact, the difficulty that made those trees more resilient. I don't know if it's right to compare people to trees at all, but that seems to have been what kept some of the trees well planted, whereas other trees fell down. It was the ones that were probably in the harsher conditions. Sometimes they ended up being stronger.
Well, I think it's a good analogy to use. I mean, one of the other things that make trees resilient is the fact that they are firmly rooted as well. So it's a good analogy, because I think, yes, the more of those sort of experiences you have, the more you have the ability. So events and dealing with them successfully builds confidence, and it does give you that flexibility. And that's why I think we've got to start quite early on. So the rings in human nature, for example, could represent the things that happened where you had sufficient support around you to teach you those skills from a young age, where people provide you with the support, and eventually every single challenge that you manage well, you're building confidence, and the confidence helps you to be more resilient, so that the next thing that you tackle, you might actually do much better, because you think, yeah, I can get through this as well, and yes, and I can go through this as well. It's the typical motivation kind of journey as well. If you, for example, want to engage people, you've got to give them little goals, not just the big dream vision, but you've got to give them little goals. And every time they manage to get or achieve one of those little goals, they get confidence, and that breeds confidence, that breeds engagement, that breeds a sense of progress, and so on and so on and so on. So I think those things are really valuable. But the key would be being firmly rooted as well. So I think if we notice that children, for example, don't have that firm root in either in a family context or the good thing, I think, is that in a Christian school you have that people look after each other, they keep an eye out for each other, and there's a sense of community that you don't necessarily get in other schools, is the sense that I get. Because often the people in a specific community also they might attend the same church as well, so there are lots of little touch points between people. Families know families because they know them from church, they know them from the same school. And so I think the touch points are also more than if you just send your kid to a school where there are people. But that, and I think the COVID term bubble is quite a useful one. But when they go to a specific school and they go to a specific church and they go to a specific sport club, it's like it's three different bubbles that have nothing to do with each other. And people only know people within that context, and it doesn't necessarily give you a full picture of the whole person. And so therefore, hiding the emotional challenge people might be going through within those separate bubbles is quite easy. But if you have a big bubble where everybody's involved, it's more difficult to hide those things away. And that's why I think that root in a Christian school, a Christian community, is a very valuable thing as well.
And interestingly, when when you observe the trees that have fallen over in this hurricane that I was a part of course, and it makes sense, but the trees that were standing alone were the first to go, and the trees that were in we didn't have forest to say in the Cayman Islands, but the trees that were together, and as you're saying, all the roots are intertwined, and also maybe the stronger trees around the outside are protecting the weaker ones on the inside. So yeah, I guess it's an analogy that could go a long way, couldn't it?
It can go a long way. I mean, it's a perfect analogy, I think.
Good. Hey, I mean, we're talking about New Zealand. One of the things that a lot of people, we get to host different principals and different people from overseas that come to New Zealand. They love New Zealand, and one of the things they can't understand, just as I can't understand, is the suicide rate in New Zealand is incredibly high. In fact, people talk about it being the highest for the younger adults in the developed world, and people just can't understand why that would be. What have you found as far as what makes resilience so low in New Zealand community that our teenagers and our young adults are really seeing the only way through a situation by giving it up?
I actually do. I interact with a lot of people who look at specifically at suicide as well. In fact, I've got a doctoral student that I'm sort of mentoring who came all the way from the United States to come and research suicide, specifically because he read it in the newspaper. And the overall conclusion is that there isn't one specific reason. I think one of the big challenges with research around suicide is the people who were successful in committing suicide don't live, so we can't ask them why they did what they did. That's the biggest challenge we've got. And so it's really difficult to pinpoint it. But there are certain things we can look out for. And although they might be signs, they might not necessarily be the reason. And it might be signs like mental health has a major impact on predicting suicide, brokenness in the family, isolation, and I think and then there's also things like substance abuse and so forth as well. I did read an interesting study a while ago where this was specifically on Catholics, and I'm pretty sure it was within the New Zealand context, where the suicide rate was incredibly low. And the reason that was given is because there's a sense of community. There's somebody who's going to have your back and watch out for you. And that is such a key statement, because when I speak to the people who do the research around suicide, whether it is suicide in young people or whether it is suicide in, let's say, for example, construction workers, one of the things that I keep picking up on is that if we can, so there must be means and opportunity. So if you have means and opportunity for suicide, it happens. And whether it's a construction worker or whether it's a young person in school age, if we can stop that opportunity, so from when they have the thoughts to when the opportunity and the means come around, if we can stop that, it is quite likely that we will prevent the suicide from taking place in the first place. The means is all about availability. It's things like poisoning, it's hanging. There's a whole bunch of different ways that people commit suicide, but it's the availability of that means that seems to be the trigger. So when it's available, it happens. So if you think about New Zealand, our population density is pretty low, which means that there might be a lot of isolation as well. And I think then that creates opportunity, because there isn't necessarily somebody around who has who looks after you and just keeps an eye out for you. The last thing I would mention is a sense of identity. It seems to me like a sense of identity is also creating quite an emotional challenge for young people, is they just don't know where they fit in and how they fit in and who they are. And one of the things that I just quickly want to mention is what I've seen over the years is if people want to find out what their identity is, they kind of need 3 coordinates. And those 3 coordinates are: where are you from, where are you, and where are you going? And if you don't have those 3 coordinates, it's very difficult to anchor yourself within, how you fit into the world. And so the interesting thing about Christianity is it has an answer for all 3 of those things. In Christianity, you know where you're from, you know who you are and who you're in, and you also know where you're going. So that sense of identity is quite a useful thing. The last thing in terms of why, for example, Christianity is an antidote for suicide is we're not allowed to take a life, and so that in itself, the fact that there's hope regardless of the situation that you're in, so there can't be hopelessness because there's always hope that the situation might actually pass over, or that the situation has a purpose, because that's what we're taught. And that lack of a sense of purpose seems to be what causes also people to want to commit suicide. Whereas in Christianity, we can see through that. We can pray about it. And there's a community that supports you as well. So I think in conclusion, in summary, there's no one answer for why people commit suicide, simply because we don't have a sample to take it from. But it's the means and the opportunity that presents itself at a specific time when things just seem to boil over. And if we can reduce, and the other thing is, if people want to commit suicide, I mean, what often happens is people think you shouldn't talk to them about it, because then they actually might go through with it. But the research pretty much shows that talk to them about it, because that's a good way. And if you're not skilled at doing it, just ask them a simple question. There's a website called "Are You Okay?" And that's how simple the question is. It's like, "Hey man, how you doing? Are you okay?" And that in itself can get someone to just think differently, to stop and think and not go through with it.
It's good. And my next line of questioning was really tackling, zoning in on this aspect of being Christian and building resilience. And so as a school principal, I've had a look at a lot of stuff, and I think Australians bring out a lot of research around resilience. They're obviously a bigger population, maybe bigger resource to do that than what we have here in New Zealand. But I think if I was to boil down the 3 really common factors that comes out in their research, it would be that as a school, we can build resilience in our children and our students if we teach them and help them to understand. Like, as you say, it's not about reading a book for them, but it's helping them understand that they're a part of something that is bigger than themselves, that there's hope for the future, that life can always get better, and that one of the key purposes of mankind is to be there for each other. And when you live in a society, or when you have a worldview that not the be all and end all, everything that happens in the world around me isn't because of my fault, so I'm a part of something bigger than myself. Things can get better no matter how bad things are right now. And it's okay to ask someone for help, as you're saying, because, the way that we're designed, I don't know that the research says design, but the way that we're built and put together is that we actually do want to help those people that are around us. And I see huge advantages for Christian schools in that. How else, I want to talk a little bit more around maybe those 3 key ideas. I think about, Paul talks about the body, and how we can't go around comparing ourselves to each other and go, well, I'm useless in this world because I'm not up the front speaking, or I'm not the person who gets paid all the money, that has all the toys. So we're all part of, resourced in different ways and gifted in different ways from the Lord to be a part of the Christian body, but we are connected and we are important in the body of Christ. That definitely, there is a hope for the future. God talks about that, and the fact that we can help each other. So from Christian message, it's perfect, isn't it? I mean,
it's the only, in fact, and this might be, I mean, this is not a provocative statement, it's a statement of truth. I think the only religion, so let's let's put other belief systems aside. The only religion that has a full story that explains the full human experience is Christianity, from start to finish to where it's going. And I've dug into this quite a lot. I mean, naturally, because of my interest in both science, but also what is it that makes people tick, and then obviously resilience comes into that as well. But you've touched on four key principles, and I'm going to quickly try and touch on all of those, and feel free to jump in and interrupt. If we look at the main predictor um, of people not being resilient and really struggling with stress, it's not the acute stress. So when we talk about acute stress, it's when you hear a loud bang, or you see something that gives you a bit of a fright, and you jump up and your heart rate goes up, and you look at what it is, and you realize it's not something that puts you in danger, and you calm down again. Like that acute stress is not dangerous for us whatsoever, but it's the prolonged stress response when our heart rate and our blood pressure and our cortisol level stays elevated for longer than it should. In other words, if it stays up, it doesn't come back to a normal state. And if it doesn't come back to a normal state, that's what not being resilient is all about. Now, what keeps all of those physiological and biochemical markers up in an elevated state is a concept called rumination, which I would simply call it worry as well. The word rumination didn't exist when the Bible was written, so you won't see it in there. But rumination is simply as adding negative emotion, which is very similar to worry. And I have looked at so much research, and rumination consistently predicts elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, prolonged heart rate recovery, prolonged blood pressure recovery, prolonged cortisol recovery as well. And the last one is important because when cortisol levels stays up for longer than it should, you can't sleep, and your immune system is suppressed, and your metabolism takes a bit of a knock as well. So cortisol is not a bad hormone. It just does what it's supposed to do, but we let it do what it's supposed to do for longer than it should. And that has a negative consequence. And so if you take that to a biblical principle, Jesus, I know of two places that said, do not worry. Who of you by worrying can add a single day to your life? So the research is finally linking up to the biblical principle of worry is not a good thing. So that's the one thing. The opposite of, and so let's park that one. The second thing is a coping strategy called seeing things in perspective. And that's just the whole mountain and molehill kind of principle. Don't create mountains out of molehills, but also don't create molehills out of mountains, because the opposite is also true. If it's just a molehill that you're dealing with and you think it's a mountain, then you over prepare, you over resource, and you waste your time. If it's a big thing that you need to deal with and you think it's just a molehill, then you're under resourced, under prepared, and you haven't asked for the help from the people who can actually help you. So that's a resourcefulness issue. So resilient people are also quite resourceful, and they can be resourceful through the connections that they have. I'm thinking about, is it Elisha and the widow with the oil? She needed Elijah's faith. She needed her children, her sons, to go and find flasks from the community, and the community had to give a flask to put all the oil in. So everybody contributed their little bit. She needed community to make that miracle come alive, and we often forget that. She was facing a big deal, but everybody's contribution made it possible for that miracle to happen. And so I think that's a key thing that we can take from Christianity as well. So that's perspective. The third thing is the sense of community. All the research that I've looked at, a sense of community, what they call connectedness, is by far the biggest predictor of longevity and of having good coping strategies as well. And I think it's because of people being resourceful. So it plays a major role in our resilience, in our mental health, even in our physical health. And then there are some logical reasons for why as well. It's much easier to get to where you need to be if you're limping and somebody helps you. And that's just the base simple principle. And sometimes we all limp a little bit, and we need a bit of help for somebody to carry us along and help us along. And then we can do the same for them as well when we are better and they need some help. Now, that's an important step, because I think one of the key things we often forget is the value in our personal health when we do something good for other people. I read a piece of research, I think it was last year sometime. And initially they set out to find out whether praying for people helps those people who you're praying for. And obviously there was a significant positive result for that. People, you pray for them, and they, whether they know that you're praying or whether they don't know that you're praying, or whether you're laying hands, there's a positive impact on it. But what they also found then is that the people who were praying for other people were also doing better psychologically and physiologically. So there's something good in doing things for other people. And I often find that resilient people tend to do that. They start doing things for other people, but not just doing things. They do things that have purpose and meaning and significance. And so that's important, because most people, when I talk to them about stress and they tell me that they're stressed, what I find is that they're actually not stressed. They're just frustrated. And they're frustrated because and so what they do is they try to seek happiness, and they try to seek satisfaction, and they try to seek all sorts of other things that just never satisfies. And so satisfaction, I think you find in your body. Your body can feel satisfied about stuff. Happiness, I reckon, you can find in your mind. And joy, I think you find in your soul. But that sense of fulfillment you don't find in any of those sort of things. Fulfillment comes from when the Holy Spirit connects with your soul. And I think they're separate. There's one Spirit. The Bible is very clear on it. There's one Spirit, but there are many souls. And so the gifts from the Spirit is what you've just talked about. Is the gifts from the Spirit, when that links into our four bubbles that we call the body, the mind, and the soul, and you have the Spirit of God coming in with the gifts from the Spirit, then suddenly, if we do what we need to do that is aligned with the gifts from the Spirit, we find fulfillment. So basically, we use our minds, our bodies, and our souls to do what the Spirit needs us to do in this world. And that leads to fulfillment. That is an incredibly powerful antidote to any situation that people might face. If you think about people like Paul, if you think about people like Stephen, I mean, these guys were stoned and killed and put in jail. Even Jesus went through incredible amount of torture. But what they did had purpose in it, had meaning in it, had significance, and was based on the gift that they were given. And they lived according to that gift. And I think it's an incredible thing that we can do to be resilient. It takes us beyond ourselves, and it takes us beyond the situation. So that was a long explanation, but I think that's what it boils down to in its essence.
I mean, for a Christian school, a verse like love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself is an incredibly important verse for us that we want to build inside our kids. And I think from my perspective, we've always wanted to do that because we think in doing that you find completeness. But really, when you talk about what you're talking about, the whole issue around resilience can be resolved in that, isn't it? Because, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and mind. That is acknowledging you're a part of something bigger than yourself. You're not responsible necessarily for all the things that go wrong in your life. It's not your fault. There's other things that play into it. God is in control ultimately.
Absolutely.
Love your neighbor is important. It connects us in with other people. And if we believe that's what other people believe for us, that outward, inward stuff. And to love yourself. You talk about identity, and then I think you were just summing it up quite nicely there around purpose. And if our young people understand that they have an identity and they're a part of something bigger than themselves, and that they have purpose, there's something specific for them to do in this world. Surely that's got to really work towards something. So when I bring that into my bigger question to say, like as Christian schools, how do we build resilience in students and our teachers in a time of uncertainty and unprecedented sort of events? We use in Christian education circles the word intentional a lot, and it's really important that those things that we talk about can quite easily, the identity thing, the purpose thing, we're a part of something bigger than ourselves thing, that they can quite easily be tied up and lost, I would say, through the pursuit of curriculum. We might pray with the kids at the beginning of the day, do someone's devotion that they wrote, years ago, that we found in a book that we thought might be good for them, or because today's the whatever day of April it is. But that intentional thing, how, building little milestones into the school day and the school week and the school month and term and year of how do our students understand and build an understanding of their identity and understanding of their purpose, and being really intentional about it is probably, as I'm starting to get those informations from you, is really the key to building resilience in our children, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, and I absolutely, and I think it's got to be intentional. I think one of the key things that I have learned over the years, though, is that unfortunately we can't force people to change their mind. It's a tricky thing, and it's all I can say, and it sounds quite blasé, but it's not meant like that. Is it's just from years of experience of talking with thousands of people. It's almost like we've got to. It's the second commandment as Christians. What we need to do is we need to walk a journey with people. We've got to encourage, we've got to support, we've got to. Sometimes you've got to just sit and listen. Whatever it is, and even be intentional about that. But then I think from a school perspective, one of the things that we can potentially do is, I'll give an example of our kids. The other day, I just noticed that one of our kids hurt her finger, and what happens if someone hits a finger? There's a big commotion around that. And then the other one, out of her own, went to the bathroom, got some water and got some salt out of the kitchen and started mixing the two together to clean her finger. And I was like, well, you know,
Yeah.
and then it's almost like you look for these little teachable moments. It's very hard work, and it means that you've got to be quite aware of what happens in a school context. I think it's even more so. But it's quite good to also then be intentional about picking up on those good behaviors and encouraging those behaviors, and building a little lesson around that as well, without being too fake around it. It's a nice conversation. We're intentional about the curriculum. We've got a plan around the curriculum, and we kind of bob and weave as we go through the curriculum, and as people have different levels of understanding around what needs to be achieved within that curriculum. But there's God's curriculum as well. And I think we just look for those moments where we either make it possible to have those moments, and when we do see those moments occurring naturally, we just encourage that and point it out. One of the best motivators is when we encourage people, and when we make it public as well, that someone has done something that's really good. And I think also teaching people to say thank you when someone did help them. That's quite a useful thing to do as well.
Mm. I'm going to go through just two last things. We're in New Zealand. We're about to come out of lockdown. We're hoping that shortly. I guess there's another 3 weeks or 2 weeks of level 3, and then perhaps schools one day will return to normal. Is this a traumatic experience for children? Like we talked about our own kids before we started the interview, just that they're dealing with it in different ways. How do we scaffold back into school as normal? Is there a need to be intentional and considerate around that time, or is it okay just to jump? Is it better to jump back into routine?
I think it is. So one of the things I'll say is I've got a reasonably big team that I'm leading in the tertiary sector as well. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that it's worthwhile to, like, some people wouldn't want you to talk about it, and some people actually wouldn't want you to stop talking about it. And so we've got to strike a medium in between. And one of the things we do is we unpack how different people worked through it. So we basically have a conversation about, so how was it for you? And through those conversations, you start picking up that somebody might say, man, that was awful for me. Because I think what we've got to acknowledge is that it might not be the COVID-19 situation that was potentially an experience for people that was traumatic or stressful. It might be what that led to. So for example, if someone lives in a house where there's abuse, suddenly you don't have that level of release, that little release valve of going to school or going to work, and you're kind of in that situation, that intense situation that's just not a nice, if you think about resilience, there was no opportunity to just sort of pull out the valve a little bit and release some of the air. So for them, it might not be the COVID-19, it might just be what that didn't enable them to do, or what else it enabled to happen, that might not be visible to us. And so sometimes it's worthwhile just having a conversation with it, or about it, and then people can contribute their ideas to each other as well. And sooner or later, I think one of the key things we can do is sharing our experiences with each other, allowing free conversation about it as well, and then in a gentle way challenge perspectives. I do that quite a lot as well. I challenge people's perspectives because I think it's an important thing. It's not about pointing out when they're wrong about a perspective. It's kind of just asking questions like, in the nicest possible way. It will boil down to things like, well, is what I'm thinking, feeling, and doing helping me or anybody else? And if it is not, then what will I think, what will I feel, and what will I do that will help me and help somebody else? So it's asking those sorts of questions as a framework for unpacking the experience people had. Talking about experiences are very cathartic as well for people. So, and it does bring things out. I am just mindful that most of the school principals I've spoken to over the years and the school counselors, in a normal situation, say to me they're under-resourced. So that's probably something that also needs to be mindful of if someone experienced somebody that had a bit of a traumatic experience around this, is how do we resource that as well, and don't put the people who need to look after the people under incredible or even more pressure.
Last question, and I just want to sum it up. Like, if you were a Christian school principal, and I think there might be a few listening to this this cast, I guess, but Christian school, building resilience, what advice would you give us? I mean, there's a whole heap of advice buried into everything we've just talked about, and
there is. I think from a resilience perspective, I think one of the key things that I would briefly touch on is, I think we've already talked about it, is find a way to build community or a sense of community around people.
Right.
Look after yourself as a school principal. Don't underestimate the need to look after yourselves as well, because the pressure of having to maintain it all and keep it all together could be quite a daunting task. So the principles, it's interesting when you talk about principles for principals, but
we are both,
the principles, you are both. The principles that we're trying to teach other people or embed in other people or encourage other people to follow apply to us as well. So we got to lead by example. And I think the three key things I think that we can focus on as in a Christian school is the sense of community and being quite intentional and active about building that and helping people to build those communities. The second thing is helping people to see things in perspective. That for me is a very important thing from a coping and a resilience perspective, because it sets the tone. So the reason why that's important is, if I think about perspective, the usual way people try to maintain perspective is they will say to themselves, well, maybe what I'm going through is not the biggest challenge that there is to go through on this planet. There are other people who are going through something worse. Well, the problem with that is it falls apart as soon as what you're going through is the biggest thing that there is to deal with.
Right.
The second perspective then is to see it within the perspective of eternity. And so 4 weeks of COVID-19, 5 weeks of COVID-19, 2 months of COVID-19, 1 year of COVID-19, within eternity is nothing. It's just, it swallows, it just dwindles away. I actually posted something on LinkedIn today about Nelson Mandela, who was in jail for 27 years. Now that works out to about 1,400 weeks. Like, he was in isolation for 1,400 weeks, but what he had is a purpose and a mission that was significant. And so he focused on that as a period of time, but it's just a period of time within a whole life that leaves a legacy. The third perspective is then to look at things from in the perspective of an almighty God. And so these are it's almost like prompts that we take people through to help them think about things in perspective. And so the third layer of perspective is the perspective of an almighty God. Now, all three of those layers of perspective works for any religion. The problem with all of them is, if it's in the perspective of a vengeful God, then you're probably not doing very well. When it's a vengeful God, you think, what have I done wrong to deserve this? Or what have all of us done wrong to deserve this? This is the end of the world. But we don't. In Christianity, it's quite unique. We don't serve a vengeful God. We serve a loving God. So the fourth layer is perspective of an almighty loving God who wants what's best for us, and who can use anything for the best, for the good. And so from that perspective, it's a very useful question to ask. So that's a perspective thing. So there's community, there's perspective. And then the last thing is the opposite of rumination. So let's not ruminate too much about it. And I think we shouldn't forget that the kids in our schools, or the students in our institute, for example, they are part of families, and and whatever happens in the family and whatever happened in that family as a consequence of this, job losses, financial insecurity, and a whole bunch of other stuff, they're part of a little system, and that system might have impacted on them. So as much as we return to normal from a schooling perspective, we still have people who have been affected quite a bit. And so how do we build communities and support around them as well? It doesn't mean we've got to do all of it. It just means we've got to be mindful of it and find ways for people to kind of support each other. And I think bring people into that mix. They might have solutions. In any school, there might be people who are pretty good financial advisors. There might be people who are looking for people for employment. There might be people who can serve other people in ways that we won't be aware of, but we kind of just put the call out there, who can help, who can do whatever. But I just want to touch on that rumination and worry. The opposite of that is meditation. And so it's just about helping people to, instead of worrying about stuff, why don't we meditate about stuff? And if you want a powerful source for meditation in the presence of an almighty loving God is called prayer. And so don't underestimate prayer. It is an incredibly powerful antidote to stress, because it combines meditation, which is thinking about good stuff, which is biblical, whatever is pure, whatever is good, whatever is lovely, think about such things. And then you're praying to God as well. That He has the best in mind for you. And one last thing I will say is, often people pray by asking questions that don't help them. And those questions go as follows. What have I done to deserve this? Why is this happening to me? And the problem with that is you will never get an answer that will satisfy you, because none of us feel that we deserve anything that comes our way that is bad. We only want what's good. But that's not the right question for an almighty loving God. The correct question for an almighty loving God would be, what is it that you want me to learn from this? What is it that you would like me to do in this situation? Show me what I can do. Show me my talents, show me my gifts that will contribute positively to the situation. And that way you're helping other people, but also you're aligning yourself with your gifts. And that leads to fulfillment within the situation as well. And it's a key thing to ask that question is, what can I do? What value do I add in this situation? And actually, maybe I can add some value, but I'm also going to need someone to add value to me as well, so show me where I can add value and show me who can add value to me. And suddenly you've got this ecosystem of people who are helping each other, which is going back to the widow with the oil. She needed Elisha to pray. She needed his faith. He contributed his faith. She gave him a place to live. She needed his sons. They needed her desperately to believe in what he had to say to make that miracle happen, because they didn't want to be sold. So they went out to go and find as many containers and flasks as they possibly could. So everybody was playing their bit, whatever they were good in. And that's, I think, what we need to create is create that. But it started with Elisha praying, them believing and asking for help, and him praying and being in the moment, because that's where we kind of center ourselves and say, right, let's figure this out, but let's start by praying instead of waiting, using prayer as a last resort. We just use it as the first resort, first point of call. It just centers you.
Good. Look, I really appreciate your thoughts on that. It's a really interesting time. Keeping in mind it is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, situation we're going through at the moment. But we will forever in Christian schools be looking for ways to build resilience in our kids. So appreciate your thoughts. If people want to know more about what you are doing, www.dealwithit.com. Is that right?
Oh, yep. Dealwithit.co.nz.
Dealwithit.co.nz.
So it's an easy one to remember. Deal with it is just one word, .co.nz. They're welcome to go and have a look at that. And I'm also on social media, so feel free to send me a message. It might take a while to respond, but I'm always happy to respond and contribute wherever I can. Because as I said, that's the kind of thing that makes me tick as well. So I love doing it, and I love hearing from people.
Good. Look, appreciate your time, and all the best for your journey as well as you get back into normal life in some stage. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks for the time as well. It's been great talking to you.
No worries. Cheers, mate. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.